Welcome to European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today, our topic is European imperialism. The main question is to define what is imperialism and, most importantly, what's the difference between empire building and imperialism. The problem is that there have always been empires. There have been empires as long as history exists. There were Mayan empires, there were Chinese empires, there was an Ottoman Empire in recent times, and yet we don't call it imperialism. So if we look at the Ottoman Empire that was built from the 1400s and existed all the way to World War I, what it really was is an expansion of territory from a core area and conquest and subjugation of surrounding areas that had absolutely nothing to do with it in terms of culture, language, religion. It was an empire that combined the Slavs of Southern Europe, the Arabs, the nomads of North Africa, and the civilization of Iran, Persia. It was all one empire. So they basically had a core that controlled and exploited the rest of the area. Is that imperialism? Not in the modern sense. Imperialism has something to do with markets, with capitalism, with production, with technology, with new ways of making money. And that, of course, comes to Hobson and his theory, and then elaborated on by Vladimir Lenin, that basically said that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And that probably would be quite a good definition. Because if we look at modern imperialism, it's not just empire building. It is not just control of territory. It has something to do with new ways of integrating the world. If you want, it's a form of globalization. And so when we consider European imperialism, the most important of those would be, of course, the British imperialism. We will not deal here with Japanese imperialism, with American imperialism. We're focusing on Europe. And in that sense, we have to compare three types of imperialism, or three forms of imperialism: the British imperialism, the French imperialism, and the Russian imperialism. Now, some people may say, well, there was also German imperialism and Italian imperialism. For our purposes, not so much, because German colonies were basically two small countries in Africa, and Italian imperialism didn't really get off the ground until the 20th century, and all they got was Ethiopia and Libya. That was not imperialism that can be compared anywhere close to the British and the French imperialism. So let us try to define the British imperialism, which is, of course, a complex topic because it spans centuries and continents, and there were no one rule. In each case of British expansion, there was a difference. But what really holds it all together is that we could say that British imperialism is commercial imperialism. British empire building is a money-making enterprise. That's what distinguishes it from any other imperialism in world history. It started out as an attempt to make money. If you recall the beginnings of British expansion into America, it was very quickly, at first, religious dissidents went there to leave Britain and set up their peaceful communities based on religion. That's Massachusetts, followed by royal colonies, which was basically just a grab of territory, to counterpose it to the Spanish in an attempt to make money on get gold, just like the Spanish did. So the money-making enterprise was to imitate the Spanish in getting gold out of America. Now, very quickly they discovered there's a market for tobacco. And then, as you know, in American history, they started growing tobacco. Very quickly, they discovered there's a market for cotton. And then the whole thing got off the ground, which was real imperialism, which is commercial production worldwide for cotton and Atlantic Triangle, where you basically send the ships to Africa, pick up the slaves. The slaves go to Virginia, produce cotton. Cotton goes back to England, and then it's shipped worldwide. That is pretty much the model that would be in various forms played out in other parts of the world. So the beginnings of imperialism grows out of empire building on the Spanish model, which was also based actually not on anything but desire to get gold, to get something out of the colonies. Now, from America, that model now goes into India, pretty much with the same kind of approach. First, they have a trading post, then you have a trading company, then you have a charters company, East India Company, West India Company. They all follow the same pattern. They establish trading posts. Trading posts make deals with local chieftains, both in Africa and in India, and then it goes into higher gear, which is to integrate India into world capitalist system. There's a wonderful article by Karl Marx, which is called British Rule in India, where he explains very well how capitalism works in case of the British conquest of India. The British conquest of India is not like the Ottoman conquest of the Middle East. It is commercial. What the British do, they integrate, as Marx shows, the Indian production into their worldwide operation by first of all ruining the local production. And that is a very important point, because that would be repeated over and over again by the French in Morocco, by all kinds of other cases where once the Western power comes in, the first thing they do, they ruin artisan production in the country they come, and they integrate production for their own benefits, for their own purposes, into the worldwide market mechanism. Usually at that stage in the 19th century, they would bring in cheap European products that would ruin local markets and then create a market for themselves in the new country. From that point of view, Hobson and Lenin are right. The modern imperialism is a fight for markets, but also for raw materials. Now, in terms of chronology, 18th century obviously is British expansion into Americas, and at the same time in India. The parliamentary debates that we have seen at the end of the 18th century show how the British go dizzy from the riches that they're getting out of India. But these are mostly rubies, these are mostly raw materials. It's not yet the money-making operation that would be by the time of Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century, which could be said is the high gear of expanding British imperialism as a commercial operation. Now then, of course, the tragic parts of that operation are China, and there are books and books written about the British takeover of China with Hong Kong, and then the trading posts, and then imposition on the Chinese of the treaties. And when the Chinese emperor says, no, we don't want you, thank you very much, leave us alone, then the guns go into action. And then the French and the British joint expedition in 1860, when they defeat the Chinese army, occupy Beijing, today's former Peking, and impose treaties on the Chinese to allow them more and more trading posts, which is exactly the kind of a slow takeover of China by the British and the French, and then later on it would be the Japanese. But the pattern is the same. The pattern is let us trade. That means allow us to have the trading posts and the ports. Once you have a foot in the door and have your ports, then you create relationships with the local elites, and then you begin the production, then you begin to use the market, and if they resist, you force them. And in the case of Chinese, you just don't force them, you drug them. And you basically start spreading opium to drug the population into submission. So this is the Chinese one. But then comes the third stage of the British imperialism expansion, and that's called the scramble for Africa. And that is 1880, so 20 years after the takeover of Beijing. Scramble for Africa, again, also is a huge topic, and there are books written about it. But for our purposes, it's a process of continuing along the same pattern. In 1881-82, the British take over Egypt. And what's really interesting about it is that they don't impose it, they don't take it over as an official colony. British rule in Egypt is a kind of a semi-autonomous status. almost theoretically a part of the Ottoman Empire, because the British don't care about, proclaiming it, this is our territory. All they want is what they want from Egypt is a route to India, and that is the control of the Suez Canal. So they basically jointly do it with the French, but then they push the French out of it in exchange for allowing the French to focus more on Morocco, and they will take over their British, the French-built canal, Suez Canal, and they will have a guaranteed passage to India, and that is what they want. But with that comes more appetite. Once you have Egypt, why not have Sudan? And then the British begin to move. That really creates the scramble for Africa. Once you have Sudan, then you keep on pushing forward south, and that goes into Uganda, Tanzania, and then you go pretty much almost all the way to South Africa. And then, of course, they come to South Africa as well. South Africa is Dutch, so we're going to kick the Dutch. And that brings us to the Anglo-Boer War of 1904. By the way, one of the most important wars of modern times, because this was not the war with the savages, with the Africans, with the tribal leaders. This was not bringing civilization to the backward peoples of Africa, this is not white man's murder. In South Africa, they actually encountered the whites, the Dutch settlers who had been there for 400 years, and they had to fight them. So there was no excuse that they're bringing any civilizing mission. And the way they treated them was a very good example for Hitler to follow. Because for the first time in modern history, the British used concentration camps against civilians. For the first time in modern times, they were actually physically destroying the villages of white settlers. The people who considered that their homeland for 400 years, as long as they stood on the way of British imperialism, a so-called civilizing mission, they had to be destroyed. Finally, they did conquer South Africa and pushed the Dutch settlers to the interior of the country. Now, for some reason, British imperialism, has created a reputation for itself as a kind of a, peaceful civilizing mission. The British Empire, the sun never sets on the English Empire, the kind of a aura of progress with it. And of course, if you look at the actual record of British rule in India, the devastation that it brought, well described by Karl Marx. If you look at the drugging of the Chinese and the humiliation the Chinese have experienced, and of course at the Boer War and the Africans, you would probably think that this is one of the bloodiest, one of the dirtiest experiences in recent world history. Somehow the British get away with it, and nobody thinks that they did anything particularly wrong, focusing on the 20th century and the crimes committed by the Germans. But the story of British imperialism does not end with the control of territory in this commercial empire. There's also a kind of an informal British imperialism that needs to be explained. And here I'm talking about the British control of territories that comes little by little, step by step, in the guise of being a friend. And the two cases that are important here would be the Ottoman Empire and Morocco. In both of these cases, in the 1880s, the British come with offers of joint ventures. First, they would come and they say, look, why don't we do this and that together? Why don't you allow us to have textile factories? Why don't you let us have trading posts or have some import-export operations? It would be good for you, especially in Morocco they did it like this. They say, you would benefit from it. We will give you arms and you will have good rifles. In exchange, we'll help you to set up the tax collection system that you, the Sultan, will benefit. So it's a very interesting way of not just brutal force as in China, but getting a deal with the elites that benefit the elites, that actually does make a Moroccan Sultan a little bit richer. But in the end, then they come to the next stage and say, you need the money? Well, will loan you the money. You need the factory producing rifles, we'll build you a factory producing. We're friends. So little by little, they create this kind of a relationship where the both the Moroccan Sultan and the Turkish Sultan wound up being friendly in debt to the British. And then there comes the moment when say, look, you owe us the money, and that means you have to do X, Y, and Z. You know, you have to allow us more trading posts. You have to allow us imports. You have to allow us to have what is in Morocco called proteges, which means the Jews and the Jews in Morocco, or the Christians in Ottoman Empire, that would be exempt from your laws. It would be like our foreign laws. And then they would say, the French would say that to the Ottomans, the Christians in Lebanon will not be covered by your laws. And it just goes up and up and up in terms of conditions that these sultans would have to fulfill. And then in the end, one day you wake up and you realize, oops, we lost our sovereignty. And that was the case in Morocco. But the British did not follow through. They basically gave it over to the French, which was a deal, one deal involving Egypt, deal also involving the trade-off in 1905 with Germany in Africa, and so on. But that's a separate story of the British and French intervention in Morocco. But the mechanics is important. The stages are important. First, trading posts, then loans, then building factories, then creating up the banking system or the taxation system, and then taking over the country as a protectorate, as it was the case in Morocco, or as it was in Egypt, a sort of a theoretically independent country. And the final point is about the raw materials. If we look at the example of, let's say, Iran, which was not officially a colony, unlike other areas. What you see here is that with the discovery of oil in early 20th century, and that would apply to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and the whole Middle East, as British would take it over during World War I and beyond. What you see here is a new type of imperialism. It is a kind that is geared towards extracting raw materials for free. You know, one of the greatest consequences of this is today's situation in Iran 100 years later. Basically, the Iranians will never forget how the British, and then replaced by Americans, were pumping out their oil and paying them nothing. Zero. Absolutely nothing. And then, maybe then they would start in the 1920s, 10%. And even then, it was with great difficulty. So the whole relationship with the Middle Eastern countries and the British and then British-American hyphen, is about oil and is about free extraction of natural resources and then giving off to the elites just a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more in a constant struggle who gets how much of the natural resources that do not belong to the British or Americans. They do belong to the people of these countries. But nevertheless, one more time, one of the greatest problems of today is the Iranian-Western relationships. The root of that relationship is the robbery of Iranian oil by the British and then by the Americans. So that creates a kind of a pattern of exploitation and confiscation of natural resources by Western companies that the British started and the American continued, and that problem is unresolved to the present day. So, thank you.